So thank you so much, Roger Cohen, for being here with us today and for talking to the Jewish Women's Archive. As you know, we are very interested in collecting women's stories and in sharing them. And one of the things that really struck us about your book is the way that you use your mother's story as a lens for exploring Jewish history. So I was wondering how you feel that using that lens changed your understanding, your perspective on the Jewish story.
Well, I wanted to tell a personal story. My mother was born on Human Street, hence the title, in South Africa, in a little mining town, and she grew up in a very small and tight-knit Jewish community there. And she was plucked out of it in the 1950s, following my father, a young physician, to England, post-war England, cold, rationing, putting coins in a meter, and this was too much for her. She collapsed, had what was then called post-puerperal psychosis, now postpartum depression, and was in and out of psychiatric homes. And of course this is a very common Jewish experience in the 20th century and before it, this being lifted out of a place and moved to another. And it's hard. Here in the United States we tend to think of immigration in terms of new opportunity. It's a bright sun, but of course it's also leaving something behind. It's loss. In many instances it's an attempt to forget, to assimilate. And so I thought I could tell an intimate story of my mother while telling a wider story of the psychological impact, if you like, of Jewish displacement.
Mm-hmm. You write, I told many other stories from many other datelines before I realized, returning to the place where I began, that the one story I had to tell was hers. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your process of coming to that realization that this was the story.
Well, my mother's death wouldn't leave me be. Her spirit, she was often fragile in life, but her spirit proved immensely strong. It had a grip on me, and I realized that I didn't really know what had happened to my mother. And I think we all have a fundamental urge to know where we came from. I didn't feel I really knew where I came from. I knew lots of places all around the world because I'd worked for decades as a foreign correspondent, but I didn't really know where I was from. And so I felt I had to discover what had happened to my mother when she had that breakdown, when I was an infant, when she disappeared from my life for a couple of years. And I also wanted to know where I was from before that, because like many Jews in the post-war years, my parents opted for silence. We didn't talk too much about the past. We wanted to be part of Britain. We didn't change our name. We were still Cohen. People knew we were Jews, but it was an identity that was muted. And so I set out on this journey to find out what happened to my mother. It turned out that I was able to get some of her medical records through Britain's Freedom of Information Act, and I know now that she had, for example, electroshock treatment about the same time as Sylvia Plath in the bell jar. So the description in the bell jar of Sylvia Plath shuddering as the electricity passes through, I think, is a rough description of what happened also to my mother. Mm-hmm. I know this happened on the day before my 3rd birthday. You may say, well, why would you want to know? It's just a painful, difficult memory. But I think we need to know. And I also explored the family's past in Lithuania. Look, I think there are books you choose to write, books you need to write. This is definitely in the second category. I was going to do a Middle East book, and my editor, John Siegel at Knopf, said, Middle East is a bit of a downer. Why don't you do a book on suicide, depression, upheaval, displacement? Really? I'm half joking. Look, we all have something that makes us tick. For me, if I have a knot, and my mother's story was a knot, the way to resolve it is through writing it out.
And were you left with things that you still wished you knew that you weren't able to uncover?
Well, I would have liked to have all the medical records of my mother, because she disappeared for months. In fact, there were only fragments. It was I was lucky even to get that. There were 3 weeks of records and not months of records. There are always, I think, things that you don't know, but I do feel that at this point, I've explored as completely as I could not only what happened to my mother, but what happened to my family, how I came to be a young English boy sitting in Westminster Abbey almost daily, because I went to this wonderful private school, Westminster School, wonderful liberal education, and I was sitting in Westminster Abbey every morning, and I had no idea that my grandmother came from the Lithuanian shtetl. I had only the vague, she spoke Russian to her parrot, that was it. I mean, and the parrot spoke back in Russian, but I had very little notion. So I feel I've done what I could, and that's brought me to a much greater acceptance of what has often been a painful family story. Although I hope the message of the book is not just one of sorrow and pain. I do think mental illness is the last taboo, and it's a good thing to talk about it and air these things. But my mother's love and stoicism in death, she died 15 years ago of cancer, and cancer to her was always a derisory thing compared to mental illness. She had great force in her love, and it's a story also of stoicism and perseverance, love, hope.
And belonging. You write a lot about belonging.
Yeah, I do. It's an important word, and I've come to the conclusion that belonging is really right up there among fundamental human needs and instincts, along with love. It's a fundamental need, and look, my mother was a transplant who didn't take in Britain. She always craved return to South Africa. And in some strange way, so was I. At some point, my Jewish identity, although I had very little, became important to me, and lo and behold, I ended up in Israel at the end of my college years for several weeks, exploring Israel and my Jewish identity. As I write in the book, there was always something a little bit uneasy about Jewishness in Britain. It was shocking for me to arrive in New York and realize that Jewish identity could be lived exuberantly. And I remember my mother in my teens, the incident is in the book, of sitting in a restaurant, and she always used to cut her spaghetti even though I implored her not to, and just pointing to a family across the way and saying, "You see that family, darling, they're Jewish." And Philip Roth makes this point of dropped voices when speaking about Jews, even Jews speaking about other Jews. And part of the bargain in Britain, I think, is that on the whole you're discreet about your Jewish identity, and there are no barriers to what you do. But you don't make a fuss about it. If there's some comment like, "Oh, that's so Jewish," you just sort of suck it up. Let it go. And at a certain point, I didn't want to let it go. I wasn't prepared to let it go, and it was somewhat shocking for me moving back to Britain after 30 years away as a foreign correspondent, the last 10 in New York when I became an American citizen. And you just don't think at all, certainly not in New York City, about, you're just a Jew, and that's fine, and that's it. And shortly after I arrived back in Britain, I was at my sister's place, and she had a lodger at the time, and I'd written a column. And I had a BlackBerry at that time. The New York Times used to issue BlackBerries, now iPhones, of course. So this guy suddenly pipes and said, "Oh, I see you have a Jewberry." And I said, "What, Craig? What are you talking about?" Yeah, a Jewberry. I said, "I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about." He said, "Well, BlackBerry Messenger, the BlackBerry Messenger, BBM, you can send messages between BlackBerries." He said, "Well, yeah, BBM." And I said, "I still don't follow." He said, "Well, it's free." So I just, you completely forget in the US, I would say more or less anywhere in the US today. I mean, obviously things have changed over the past 50 years, and there's been anti-Semitism in the US just like anywhere. But that sort of comment I can do without.
You mentioned also, in terms of thinking about changes and social changes, and you talked about mental illness as the last taboo, and so much of your book is about silence, and I think we have come a long way in being able to break some of that silence around Jewish heritage, around mental illness. I'm wondering what you see as the silences that we still keep.
Yeah, just on belonging, if I could add one thing. I did find my great-uncle, it turned out my great-uncle Michael Adler had, my great-grandfather's brother, had been a rabbi, and he was a distinguished rabbi. He was a rabbi to Jewish soldiers in the British Army during World War I. He would go around the battlefields, Passchendaele, Flanders, Belgium, France, giving last rites to Jewish soldiers. And I found his diaries. And in them, in 1918, he's writing, have we, the House of Israel, finally demonstrated to king and country and then empire that we, the Jews of Britain, are loyal citizens just like everyone else? Has this sacrifice finally laid to rest any doubts? And again, are we really completely part of this English story? Right. And of course, British Jews were lucky to find themselves in Britain. An Iron Cross for a German Jew for valour at the Somme during World War I did not stop him being sent to the gas 30 years later. So that anxiety was entirely well placed. And it was the anxiety that Herzl perceived in 1896 when, as a foreign correspondent like myself, covering the Dreyfus case in France and seeing a Jewish officer unjustly accused of treason, he concluded, reluctantly, I think Zionism was a reluctant conclusion. Mm-hmm. I think if Jews had found full acceptance in European society, the question wouldn't have arisen. But in fact, half acceptance into Christian society proved more dangerous than non-acceptance, because suddenly here were the Jews in the professions moving into the centre of society, and this caused resentments. And in the right conditions, i.e. a humiliated Germany after World War I, those conditions proved entirely conducive to Nazism. So, if you ask me why I'm a Zionist, I would say also it's a reluctant conclusion, but Jews needed a homeland. They never entirely belonged. Now, your question was on silence and forgetting. Yeah, I think we have come a long way. I really do. I think there are still silences in Europe. There's this choice of discretion. Even in the New York Times recently, I noticed after the shootings at the kosher supermarket in Paris and at Charlie Hebdo, a woman was interviewed, and she was saying, she was a Jewish French woman, and she was talking about her story, and then she said, "Oh, but mon mari, my husband, c'est un vrai Français. He's a real Frenchman." Right. So again, there's that I'm one thing, and the rest of society is another. And I think there's still a lot of silence about those issues. I think there are taboos, half taboos, semi-taboos, about Israel, the Jewish homeland in the United States, about, for some people, to have a really open debate, whether on a college campus or anywhere, about Israel and the issues that have arisen. There's been this hugely successful Zionist experiment, and a modern state of Israel has been created that is a wonder. It is a truly remarkable thing to see this vibrant and prosperous democracy, but it's built still on this uneasy foundation of the statelessness of another people, the Palestinians, who were in the Holy Land when Jews began to move there under the Zionist movement. So, and of course, being strangers in a strange land is, through the millennia of the diaspora, this is very familiar to Jews, and that which is painful to yourself, do not do to. I mean, it's very fundamental in Jewish ethics, I think, are precepts that make this condition in which Israel finds itself today a difficult one, and one that I hope will be resolved one day through the establishment, as the United Nations prescribed in 1947, of two states for two peoples. It seems infinitely distant today, but I do think we need to talk about it, and I think there are still areas of silence, areas of unease concerning open debate about those issues, and I try in my columns to encourage a debate. I mean, everybody has a different position. My own liberal, two-state, liberal Zionist position, if you like, has become somewhat unfashionable, it seems. People talk of one state. I think that's completely fanciful. Jews need a homeland. One state is not going to be a Jewish homeland anymore, so that doesn't work for me.
Right. Well, I think, as with any experiment, the point of experiment is that it's unfinished and it challenges, and there's growth that needs to happen. And it reminds me, that's the sort of global stage, I think, of one of the themes that you explore in your book is the difference between memory and truth. And you talk about how you realize that the only truth you can come to is your own. And I think we see that on a global stage in terms of thinking about what is the difference between memory and truth. And I was also really interested in how that plays out in your book and the personal story of your family. And I was wondering whether, I mean, obviously the book that you've written is trying to uncover certain truths about your mother, but it's also from your perspective. And I was wondering whether, how the rest of your family has responded to this book. Do they have different stories and truths about your mother that they feel are represented here or not represented here?
Well, yes, I first started thinking a lot about memory when I covered the Bosnian War in the 1990s. I covered the breakup of Yugoslavia, which a war in Europe, ethnic cleansing of the Muslims of Bosnia, processed through concentration camps set up by the Serbs, not death camps, but concentration camps where people were concentrated and selectively killed, women and children then pushed into exile, non-dangerous, men not perceived as a threat, also processed through. And memory had gone wild in the Balkans. It had gone completely wild. To the Serbs, the Muslims of Bosnia were Turks. It was a recreation of the Ottoman Turks of centuries before. All the unprocessed, painful memories of World War II came to the surface again. And so often I would be with Bosnian soldiers and they would be staring into the haze and they would say to me, "You see my home? I'm fighting to go home. I was chased out of here a year ago, 2 years ago." And you couldn't see anything. I mean, any more, than out there, there's a snowman standing in the middle of that field. There isn't, there's just snow. And all you could see was a head, but he could see it. He could see his house. In his memory, it was there. He knew what he was fighting for. And so often there were situations like that in which I just realized that memory is a living thing. It moves and eddies. It's buffeted. And people like Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian dictator, manipulate memory. They manipulate a sense of victimhood that may or may not be based in fact. And you see Vladimir Putin doing the same thing in Russia today, stirring up violent nationalist sentiment on the basis of manipulated memory. So I am very interested in memory and the way it plays out. And I try to explore that in the book. Look, I think people have so many different memories of my mother, because one of the things I talked about the postpartum depression. For the last 25 years of her life, she was manic depressive. She was bipolar. She alternated between states of extreme agitation and activity and states of desperate inertia, which in 2 instances led to very serious suicide attempts that she survived miraculously. And one of the catalysts of the book was my finding in an attic in my parents' house in Wales, farmhouse in Wales. My mother hated it. Rain, cold, wind, all the things she hated. She wanted the sun. Africa, right? She wanted the Mediterranean or the cocoon of sunlight of South Africa. And when I imagine my mother, I see her in South Africa, I see her laughing on a beach in the sunlight with her floppy hat, sunglasses. And when I see her in England, I see a shrunken figure who's struggling, whose gaze is trying to come to the surface, who's under some cloud, and not just the dirty bathwater skies of England, but something much deeper and more mysterious. And one of the things about bipolarity is it's a kind of dual personality thing. And so was my mother this hyperactive woman buying and selling houses, doing things, buying a ticket on Concorde, getting into argument, or was she this depressive figure? The answer is she was neither. The real June, who came out occasionally, was a highly intelligent, vibrant, erudite, funny, loving woman that she could only be at times. And who worked as a magistrate but then had to give that up because her condition became untenable. And So I needed to try to remember and portray my mother through all that. My sister, who lived these experiences more closely than anyone else, and she likes the book, and I think feels that, I mean, I'm sure she would write a different book. And of course she lost my mother. I had 2 years of my mother's love, then she disappeared. My sister didn't have that. She was born and my mother disappeared. I think I was lucky, you know, painful, and obviously it impacted my psyche and behaviour too. But, you know, my sister talks of standing in the yard of our house in Hampstead and looking at the house and thinking, wouldn't it be nice if I wasn't an orphan? And this is not normal. You know, this is not normal. But she had those feelings as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old. My father is now almost 94, and he lives in Scotland. He always encouraged me to write the book, and I don't think finding these documents in the attic in Wales with the suicide notes and my father's very precise physician's annotations on what happened in those years of horror, I don't think that was a coincidence that he preserved those. But he's very, he's not gaga, but he's very far away now, and it's hard to, I certainly can't talk to him about it on the phone. Mm-hmm. He has the book. I hope I will have some sort of conversation with him about it. And you know, my mother, I see pictures of my mother now in the Washington Post or in papers in Britain. You know, she disappeared, so that was one of the things, you know, when she died, my father, we all make choices in painful situations, and he had begun another relationship. The marriage lasted 49 years, and for the last years of that, my father was involved with another woman whom he subsequently married. You know, I conclude in the book, I can't judge him. I think he did the best he could in the circumstances, and but now there is this, you know, my mother's story is there. It's there for all time. I'm very pleased about that. I think she disappeared. We didn't, you know, the house was sold. My father moved on. He'd suffered immensely. He broke down completely when my mother died. He said it's like falling in love again. He was bereft and shattered. He'd gone through something. You know, mental illness is a charnel house. It destroys families. It destroys people. It's a terrible thing, and we need to talk about it.
Well, and I think you did such a wonderful job of bringing your mother's story to life. I think she really comes off the page in all of her complexity, and also there are the palpable, you know, absences of where you don't have the, you know, where the information is still missing, which I think is an important reminder of what we can know about a person and document about them, and what is always elusive. And I'm wondering, you know,
I should say, you know, there's always, with a book that is this personal, there is a tremendous writer's struggle that goes into finding a tone. It's an intimate book, but you don't want it to be in any way over demonstrative about the suffering involved, and there are things I didn't write, there are things I left out, so it's a question of, and also in this book, of course, I was trying to weave together many different themes, and I realized as I was writing this would work for some people, others might find it hopped about, but I think if you read it carefully, at least I certainly hope so, that you know, the themes do knit it together. I wanted that knitting together to be more elusive than, you know, knocking the reader over the head with, you know, this is why these things are connected. I think a careful reader, a sensitive reader will feel those connections.
Absolutely, and in terms of the weaving together of different generational stories too, I think there are interesting patterns there. I was curious how I mean, you talk a lot about your mother as an immigrant and how that piece of her story impacted her, you know, her illness and her life. And I'm wondering where you see gender fitting into that too. Do you think there are aspects of her story that are were really determined by the fact that she was a woman?
I do. I think if she'd been born 20 years later, it wouldn't have been assumed that her role was essentially a supportive one of my father as he pursued his brilliant career. My father was an immigrant who was appointed commander of the British Empire. He was a very distinguished scientist. But my mother's role was, and she saw it that way, was essentially to support him and to raise us. And I think that confined her in a way in which she wouldn't have been confined a couple of decades later, and possibly, this is all totally hypothetical, possibly that would have given her a greater sense of fulfillment, or another avenue in life that would have proved less hard for her. I mean, I have to say, I'm positing something in this book, which is that for my mother, whose grandfather had arrived penniless in South Africa, but had been a very successful man, founded the OK Bazaars, which was co-founder with two other men of the OK Bazaars, which was like the Macy's of South Africa, a department store chain. So she was, her grandfather's house became known as Chateau Michael. He was called Isaac Michael. There were these lavish parties. She was fun-loving and vivacious, and she loved it. And I posit in the book that being plucked out of this removed the foundations of her life, and for her particular psyche and sensibility, this was overwhelming. Can I prove it? No. Would she have gone through exactly the same thing had she never left South Africa? I don't know. I don't think so. I do know that she collapsed when she arrived in Britain, and she always, at the end of her life, spent as much time as she could in South Africa and craved that return. But the field, it's known as epigenetics, is still a young one, and it studies how trauma, for example, in Holocaust victims, can affect genetic makeup in ways that get passed down. I think it's a very interesting field, and my own experience as correspondent in Germany of the New York Times, having been married to a woman whose grandmother was killed in the camps, and seeing the impact of that loss and anxiety down the generations, I find it very persuasive that this kind of trauma it doesn't just end. It is passed down. My mother, of course, we skirted the Holocaust. We were lucky. We fled the pogroms. South Africa was about as good a place for Jews to be in the 20th century as there was. So, but those anxieties, that Jewish, the Holocaust happened in the middle of her life. It was there, so it certainly impacted her. I do think it could. I do think that as a woman she faced obstacles, barriers, and struggles that as a man in Britain she wouldn't have. And all her friends, many of her friends, were similar. They were highly intelligent Jewish women whose role was to support their husbands and raise their children, which is okay as far as it goes, but then the children grow up, and of course there are frustrations.
Right, as another Jewish woman, Betty Friedan, wrote about very well in The Feminine Mystique 50 years ago. I loved how you ended the book with a quote from one of my favorite Yehuda Amichai poems, Tourists, in which he talks about redemption depending on seeing individual humans in their daily life, and not just the large sweep of history and facts and artifacts. And I'm going to read the line that you quote from it. "You see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who's bought fruit and vegetables for his family." And I thought this was such a great way to frame also what you've done, and which you could rephrase that as, you see the story of Jewish history in the 20th century, well, look left and down down a bit, and there's a woman who's struggling and trying to love her family. So I guess my big question is, looking at the story that way, what kind of redemption do you think is possible when you tell a story like your mother's as a way of giving a personal take on the larger Jewish story?
Well, thank you for that analogy. I'd never thought of it quite in those terms, but it's a powerful analogy. I do think those lines of Amichai are extraordinary, because I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I've spent a lot of time in conflict, and history is all very well, but you've got to put food on the table. And what matters in the end is the future, it's not the past. It doesn't matter if Jews and Palestinians never agree on what happened in 1948. They'll never agree anyway. For Jews it was a liberation, it was the foundation of a modern state of Israel. For Palestinians it was loss. In many cases, hundreds of thousands of cases, loss of their homes. It was the Nakba, it was the catastrophe. We'll never agree. That's okay. It might be preferable if it had been otherwise, but that's it, that's what happened. Narratives don't have to converge in order for peace to be built. And I'm always struck. Here's a guy who's bought fruit and vegetables for his family. That's a prosaic thing to do. There's nothing glorious or special or wondrous about it. It's just a man looking after his family. And I'm reminded of the doctor in Camus' The Plague, which I reread in the light of the Ebola virus, and a novel everyone should read twice in my view. And the doctor, whose name I forget, but at a certain point he says to a journalist he's talking to, he says, in the end, the important thing is decency in these extreme conditions of the plague. And the journalist says, but what do you mean by decency? And he says, well, I don't think I can say what I mean in general by decency, but I know what it is in my own case. In my own case, it's doing my job. Just carrying on as a physician in hopeless circumstances, trying to cure people, and so make things better. And in the same way, this man is being decent. He's buying fruit and vegetables for his family. And if there's one thing I would like to see in the Middle East, it's prosaic words. Jobs, food, the future. It can be done. It requires setting aside the rhetoric. It requires being prosaic. It requires making a tough deal that involves for each people giving up things they care about a lot. But it's doable. Don't tell me, after I've lived in Germany and driven across a border that no longer exists to Poland, 60 miles away, where millions and millions and millions, dwarfing the casualties in the Middle East, were killed 70 years ago. Now you can't even see the border. These things can be done, and it's by building peace that we find redemption. It's by building something better that a convulsive past, a painful past, can be redeemed. And I tried to tell this story because I believe in that kind of redemption. I wanted my mother's struggle to be known to more people. I think it's much more widespread than many believe, and I hope that people will find some form of consolation or redemption in that story. Certainly for me, it's been, I feel I redeemed my family's story, and I have found acceptance. Have I had some great epiphany that will guide me for the rest of my life? No.
Would be nice, but we can't count on that.
Yeah, but I do feel this acceptance, which I think is a prelude to greater peace, and I'm more and more deeply interested in my own Jewish story. I would like now to learn Hebrew, and so that's something kind of going forward. But the Jew I want to be is a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that comes through beautifully in your book is hope. Even though you're telling a story that's really a painful one and is a story that is in large part about brokenness, I think there's really a thread of hope that weaves through all of it. So I think that's one of the great successes. And I just want to thank you for sharing the story of your mother with everyone through this book and for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much.